Welcome to Just Thinking. This is Mary Greendale. The title of this show grew out of a lifetime of curiosity about many different subjects. Some local, some global, and some in between. For each show, I will open with my thoughts and then bring on guests who explore the subject in greater detail. I hope the show inspires healthy discussions on camera and among viewers. To me, the sky's the limit when we are just thinking. Hi, I'm Mary Greendale, and welcome to Just Thinking. Today, my guest is State Representative Carolyn Dykema, and Carolyn and I are going to try to do this on a quarterly basis, where we have a little bit of time to chat about what's been going on in the legislature and what's coming ahead, and if you can predict it all, that would be interesting. But at any rate, so Carolyn, welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
And I love this idea. You know, I think people are eager for more news and more information, and it's just a great opportunity for me to be here and share with folks. So thank you for the invitation.
Oh, no problem. And I hope we were able to do it on a quarterly basis. So for the first thing, would you please just remind me where your district covers now, because it has shifted over the years?
Sure. So I have 4 communities that I represent, essentially right along the 495 belt. So Holliston, which is where I live and call home, is on the southern end of the district. I also represent Hopkinton, Southborough, and 1 small precinct in Westborough.
So you've got Worcester County. The others are in Worcester County, aren't they?
Southborough and Westborough are Worcester County, and then Middlesex County for Holliston and Hopkinton. And I used to have 1 precinct in Medway, which was Norfolk County. So at one point I had 3 counties, so 2 is less challenging.
Oh, right. So you guys are out for the year. I mean, the season's over, so to speak.
Well, we're out of formal session, which means that we don't take roll call votes on major pieces of legislation anymore. But there's still, you know, plenty of smaller pieces of legislation that are still moving. In fact, I have a piece of pollinator legislation that deals with pesticides that it may be a long shot, but I'm still hopeful that if we get broad consensus, so if we get bipartisan support and no one opposes a bill, it can still move forward until the end of the year.
Yeah, and what is that bill? What does it do?
So it's there's a type of pesticide called neonicotinoid pesticides that are being increasingly linked in the scientific community to bee decline. And if you watch bees and bee health and pollinator health, as many of our local beekeepers do, we've got a lot of local beekeepers, the bee population is really a concern. And with the bees go, you know, about a third of our food supply. So it's a global problem. It's not just here in Massachusetts or even nationally. So what my bill does would say that only folks that are trained and licensed to use these pesticides by the Department of Agricultural Resources are able to purchase them and use them.
That is one of the things, is I don't think any of us as homeowners really know how to use a lot of the products that are available over the counter, but at any rate, that's another story. So in a nutshell, what was the best and the worst, the highlights of this past session?
Yeah, well, you know, it was a pretty productive session, and when we were talking about this show, it gave me an opportunity to reflect, because we tend to sort of look forward and don't spend a whole lot of time looking back. And I would say, you know, one of the key pieces of legislation that we passed has to do with climate and renewable energy. It's a growing topic of conversation in the legislature, and we've passed, you know, some larger pieces of legislation, I would say, every session now for the last 6 or 8 years on climate and renewable energy. So this year what we did is increased the RPS standard, which is, yes, it's a lot of jargon, but essentially
per second, no?
It's the amount of renewable energy that local or that power utilities have to purchase from renewable sources. So that is about 13% every year now by statute, and it increased by 1% every year. And per this legislation, it will now increase by 2% every year, sort of moving. The idea would be moving to as much renewable energy as we possibly can. And it also created a new incentive around storage and sort of increasing the use of storage. Storage has the potential to be transformative for renewable energy. And if you think about it, solar obviously is what people often think of for renewable, which is great in the summer and you get a lot of power, but you can't rely on it because either at night or during the winter, when we use a lot of heating, obviously here in Massachusetts, it's not reliable. So unless you can store it, it's really not a long-term solution for us. But storage potential is very much on the horizon. Hopefully, a lot of it being developed right here in Massachusetts with our research and higher ed institutions.
Yeah.
So this bill kind of incentivizes projects that combine storage capability with peak use, as they call it, so to kind of offset some of our peak demand so that we don't have to increase our base supply. So we're getting there. It's an incremental step, and we're going to keep at it. I think one of the challenges is, and there's a lot of very vocal environmental advocates who, for obvious reasons, are pushing because of the climate change concerns. Our struggle in the legislature is to balance, how far and how fast can we move on renewable energy while still being mindful of the rate impacts on ratepayers.
Sure.
Because a lot of this is more expensive than what we're currently paying for. So we're sort of doing a stepwise approach as opposed to, major overhauls every session, which I think is going to serve us well in the long run.
That's very interesting. How do you store this stuff? I mean, so you've collected energy, and what do you store it in?
It's a battery. It's a very big battery, essentially.
Battery.
And we don't have the technology at this point to store it on a large scale. There's some smaller scale storage capacity technology, but that's really where we're hoping by incentivizing, it'll bring the private sector to really do more looking at that. Interesting.
So in this last session, was there anything dealing with the infrastructure issues in Massachusetts? Every city and town has its own. Many of us, if not all of us, have concerns with our water systems.
Right.
Water mains that live in the streets and have been in the streets maybe for 100 years. Did anything happen this year in that area?
Yes.
Oh.
As you know, water is, I have a lot of local connection to water. And in fact, this is where I got educated, right here in Holliston, on water and sewer and things like that. And I brought that to the State House, and that's one of the things I've really been advocating for and trying to educate my colleagues about, the importance of water. And we were able to put additional funding into the Clean Water Trust, which is the program at the state level for funding water. Predominantly a loan program.
Low interest loan.
Very low interest loan. Although unfortunately with interest rates being as low as they are now, it's not as competitive as it has been in the past. But we're hopeful. We put some more funding in through the environmental bond bill that we passed this year. And there's also a supplemental budget that's going to be coming up where we've got some additional funding as well. And the hope is that at least a portion of that will be available for grant funding as well. So towns that put in for some of these low rate loans can also maybe get a portion of that offset with permanent grant funds.
Okay, that's good. That is really good news. And that's something that Holliston would be eligible to apply for?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, Holliston, I think we were talking to Sean Reese at the last meeting with the selectmen, and Holliston has the treatment plant that they need to put in to deal with the manganese issue. And so that would be a possible solution for that, and I know that Sean is aware of that. And the senator and I also put in $2 million in that same environmental bond bill for that treatment plant as well, to hopefully offset the cost to the town.
Well, I know that Sean is also concerned, or Mr. Reese, director of the DPW, is also concerned about the cost of doing this, 1 mile a year kind of reconstruction of water mains that are in the ground, trying to get those pipes and mains done. Can you double dip? Can you go in and be looking for money for the treatment facility and also look for money for the replacements?
Sure. I mean, there's nothing statutorily that would prevent a town from doing that. Obviously, there are limited funds, and the state tries to equalize the distribution across the state as much as possible. But, you could certainly do kind of subsequent years of application and things like that. Okay. They like it when towns have a long-term plan.
Yes.
In fact, I think you get looked at a little more favorably when you can show you've really done your homework and you've planned out, to show how it will impact, rates here at home, because obviously, that impacts folks in the pocketbook, and they want to know before making the commitment that the town's on board.
Yep. One of the things that does come up is that there is a worry that water is being stressed. We're using a lot of it. We try to find ways to limit how much we're using of it. We don't have storage capacity there for some of it. So the question that, you have to ask yourself is, do you stop growing? Does the state at some point come in and say, yeah, you're going to run out of water, you can't support more people? Does that ever cross in the conversation? I mean, it's sort of a...
I guess I see it as a tremendous opportunity for innovation.
Okay.
And back in 2012, Senator Eldridge and we were on the Water Infrastructure Finance Commission at the time, and we took a trip to Israel. Israel recycles 75% of their water. And the next, at least at the time, the stat was the next highest rate was 9% in Spain.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
We're even below that.
Yeah.
So that just shows what the potential is if you put your mind to it and if you put the innovation behind it. And there is a sort of a cluster of water innovation technology companies here in Massachusetts. And I think with the climate impacts and with drought, we had a drought here in Massachusetts that was pretty significant last year, very significant for agriculture. Yeah. And I think that type of condition just encourages more innovation and development. So I would think, I'm kind of bullish on the opportunity around water and being more creative. That said, I did file some legislation that would look at how we deal with drought. Because unfortunately, what happens is we wait too long to make decisions about decreasing water use. And as you know, there are water restrictions at the local level, but they're patchwork across the state. There's no consistency in terms of, how they're defined and what the water limits are. So especially during times of drought when you're more, it's more critical, especially around private wells, for example. Private wells are completely exempted from the ban, yet it still pulls from the same water supply. And ironically, they're also the first ones to get hit and start losing water when the water supply, the water level goes down.
Makes sense.
So what my bill would look at sort of broadly, how do we want to set these restrictions for water use to make them consistent during extreme times, and give the governor authority to hopefully kind of identify oncoming drought at an earlier stage in the process so we can decrease usage and
sooner
offset the critical impacts later on. So that bill, I filed that last year, and didn't get much traction. It's kind of early in the conversation, but I'll refile again this session and go from there.
So looking at the past session, was there anything else? You talked about the pollinator bill. Other highlights or lowlights?
Yeah, I like to stick with the highlights, Mary.
Well, you're such a positive person.
Got to be positive. As I was saying, I was sort of doing a review of what we've done, and there's definitely a public safety theme to what we've done over the last session. Some bills, like a bill on firefighters. The firefighters have advocated for a long time around toxics.
Oh, yes.
And presumptive connection to job when you're looking at some cancers. And so you assume that even though impacts may not hit until long after you've left service, you still are owed the support and the benefits there because of your service. So we passed that this year. We also passed more police training funds.
Oh, good.
Which have been in the works and advocated by our local police departments for a long time.
Yep.
We had, as you may know, on Sunday, we had the awards given out to our public safety folks. And what's always striking to me, in addition to how much important and very life-saving work our public safety officials do, is the change in the nature of the job. And you may have, heard about it from your family members, but so much more mental health and emotional health issues that our public safety folks are dealing with. Yeah. Training, how do we train to account for that? Is a big part of it. So that was, hopefully that'll be an important step. And a related issue is the criminal justice reform piece that we passed, which has been in the works for a long time, and really looking at how we bring people back into society and not see criminal behavior, especially at a young age, impact you for the rest of your life and keep you from, fulfilling your potential. And if you look at the cost of incarcerating someone, which is around $50,000 a year.
Yeah, per person.
Per person.
Right.
And in fact, and there's more and more research on this, it actually makes you much more likely to commit another crime when you get out.
Sure.
When I think what we all would rather see is how do we hold people accountable, but do it in a way that encourages better behavior and kind of encourages turning of a page and starting again when they get out. So that's really what this criminal justice piece was about.
I know there are some people who look at that as being easy on the criminals, that kind of thing, and that you can't be soft on crime and all of that. But it doesn't make it makes intuitive sense that by keeping people who, especially the younger ones, in a peer group with other people who have been doing bad things, maybe worse things than they did, all you're going to get is more of the same. I mean, but anyway.
Well, technology has changed the lay of the land tremendously because, people have sort of their philosophies about what they think works, but the data that's been able to be collected is starting to show us what actually works.
Right.
And from a policy perspective, it makes it much easier,
if you
I guess,
will.
or more straightforward.
Better informed, at least.
Right, in actually, aligning policy with outcomes versus sort of this philosophy or opinion about.
Opinion. Yeah. It's opinion. It really is. And anyway, I don't know if you remember, but I bet you do, that the HCAT studio has a personal interest in one particular piece of legislation, and that would be the PEG legislation that was going through. This would be the one
that was before my committee, and we voted it out of committee. It was. I'm on telecom.
You are on telecom.
This session.
Okay. What happened with it?
I would say that there is broad support.
So this is for us to go high definition. Let me just write.
Yes, and to have the additional information provided on the agenda online for what's available locally, so that folks at home can know
so that you
just
can easily
is
turn on and see the schedule. Yep, I forgot about that piece.
So broad support, I would say, in the legislature.
Is there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had tremendous participation from local cable individuals. I'm still getting the emails now on the bill.
Don't give up.
Well, as with the legislative process, getting attention for your bill is kind of the biggest step. And then it's sort of working through just the details to make sure that the details are right and all perspectives are considered. And I would say I would say that's where we are, sort of the fine-tuning stage.
Okay. You think it's 50-50? You think it's got to?
I am really loath in this job.
Okay. You don't want to.
It is
betting on this.
Very unsafe to put money on anything. But I would say that it is very positively viewed.
So it's worth keeping up the effort.
Oh, absolutely.
I guess for those of us who are concerned about it, because it does, for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously the picture, but also keeping people informed. It's really, really hard if all it says is local programming, on your little remote.
Well, and I want to give credit to all of the local cable outlets who are, it's hard to advocate in the legislature. It's a lot of time, to come in and testify or write to your legislators and let them know of your concerns. And you all have been very organized and very effective.
Yeah. Well, thank Don Cronin in our office. I think he's
one
of them. There we go. So, at any rate, marijuana, a biggie across the state and so forth and so on. And right now, Holliston itself is doing bylaws. The planning board and the town council have been talking about the stuff that's going to be on the ballot. Both next spring, we're going to have to do a piece that's on the ballot. And we've got the town meeting, which is October 29th. Put that on your calendar. So we have an upcoming special town election. So we will be talking about how do we manage retail here in town. Holliston already voted that it didn't want to have retail establishments. And one of the things that I read about and hear about from those cities or towns, but mostly cities, that say, hey, if we're going to take the retail, then we're going to keep all of the income. We're not distributing this in some big pool when there are revenues from this. And, this is on the radio, on NPR. I listen to NPR a lot. how might that work? Do you think that's a real situation? I mean, Holliston's going to have manufacturing here. It could have labs here. We already have manufacturing here. That makes us kind of trendsetters, I would think. Would we be penalized, do you think, for not selling it?
So the way the legislation was set up is there's a, so all marijuana sales, whether it be wholesale coming out of grow facilities or retail, has to pay two taxes. One is a sales tax, which is the standard 6.25% on sales, and then there's also an excise tax of, I think.
Now, are you saying the wholesale has to pay that tax?
Mm-hmm.
Seriously?
Mm-hmm. So all of those taxes are coming into the marijuana fund. I don't remember the specific name, but there's a fund that all this revenue goes into. All of the expenses for the regulatory structure in Massachusetts for this new industry are paid for out of that fund.
Okay.
And any additional leftover funds go to the general fund that we appropriate through the legislature.
Okay.
Which means that those funds would go to things like municipal police training, would go to education, would go to all of those programs that we fund through the state general fund that come to our cities and towns.
Right.
So we are all getting benefits, revenues from the marijuana sales. What was discussed when we passed the legislation was this notion that there were a lot of cities and towns who did not want to have a part of the distribution business. If you look at the data, you look at what's happened in other states, there's definitely a greater municipal impact from having a distribution facility versus a grow facility, from a public safety impact as well as many other things. So where we ended up in the legislation, which is always kind of a compromise and a give and a take, there's a provision that says if you are a community that's willing to have a distribution, a retail, non-medical distribution facility, you have the option to add up to 3% additional sales tax on the sales that come directly to the community. And that is up to the community to decide where between 0 and 3%, if at all, they want to do that. It's similar to the meals tax.
Yep, I got you.
So it's a local option tax, and that's what
that makes sense.
The law provides for now.
Yeah.
So it's sort of an incentive too, that if you're willing to have that additional consequence and additional, frankly, public safety responsibilities and things, then you're able to have this additional tax revenue to support it.
That makes sense. Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
The other thing is that, and I know Holliston has, with at least one of its growers, is a host community agreement. So that would be another opportunity for towns like Holliston who assuming they continue with the moratorium on the retail distribution, then they could still negotiate through the host community agreement with the growers for an additional.
Are you aware that Mayflower Medicinals is doing a public meeting? I think it's tonight.
No, I hadn't heard about that.
I hadn't either, but I found it on the website for Youth and Family Services yesterday. I was trying to do an article about the new court diversion officer or person that's up there. And there it was this posting from Mayflower Medicinal. It's at 6 o'clock, and I want to say it's at the library. But it's an open meeting for anybody that's interested in finding out more about how they operate. If you have any questions, regarding it, they're there. So take that for what it's worth. But I wish it had been promoted a little bit better so that there was a real, opportunity for everybody to really get in there.
Well, I think you've just promoted it, Mary.
There we go. It's out there now. But I wish it had been sooner. Anyway, one of the other issues that I'm sort of in a flutter about, former town tree warden Mark Aronian spent a lot of time trying to take down trees that were dead and so forth. And after the drought that you referenced earlier, and after a few years of gypsy moths and a few years of whatever the others were, winter moths, we have all over, not just in Holliston, I'm sure your other towns show it too, so many dead trees standing. I mean, it is just amazing. If you focus on it now, everywhere you drive, anything that doesn't have leaves on it, that tree's dead, okay? There's been plenty of water. It's not that it's been stripped for lack of the water or for bugs. It's dead, okay? And Robert Wideneck and I were walking 1 mile on the trail. We came across 30 trees that were literally at peril of, if and when they fall, they're going on a trail,
Or on the power lines.
Or on the power lines, and that's not good either. No. But so you've got these dead and dying trees on the one hand, all of which affects the environment in a very serious way. Trees are just so important, and I could do an entire week-long show on trees. But the second thing is that you also have invasives. You have all of the bittersweet. You have the native poison ivy, but it's still an invasive the way it behaves. You've got, I won't bore you with the list, but at any rate, those plants are choking out healthy trees by blocking the light and the sun from the leaves and so forth and so on. But you can't tell the difference unless you're really, really alert. Now, is there any conversation in Boston about this subject?
There is, actually, and it's getting increasing attention. In fact, we put some additional resources in the same environmental bond bill this year to deal with invasives, and I filed an amendment to the bond bill to do an additional invasives approach, because we've got them in the water as well.
Yes, this is true.
Holliston had the water chestnuts over at Lake Winthrop that they did local. So bottom line is there are grants available through the state, and it's usually a partnership between DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and some local nonprofit or community group that would actually do the hands-on community work with funding and support, both financial support and research support and a lot of the expertise around how you best manage invasives and deal with them that can be provided by state resources. So I would say if anyone has an interest in dealing with any particular area or particular type of invasive, contact my office and we can arrange for a meeting and see what help might be available. I know in Southborough, I represent Southborough, and they had a big initiative to get rid of the bittersweet in one of their big fields. Conservation land that was being overtaken by the bittersweet, and they arranged for a whole lot of volunteers to go out and pull. And while it's a great initiative, I have to say I think they were a little bit frustrated because it does grow so fast, and that's why they call it invasives. It just can take over, and it's got to be an ongoing management effort.
The golf course has done a great thing, and the managers at the golf course have bought different equipment. At first, they bought equipment that would just keep mowing it. You mow down underneath the trees and stuff just to keep it down. And then this year they went ahead and they bought machines that can just pull it out. And it's really pulling it out that's long-term most effective, But those pieces of equipment are expensive. So that's one of the things that I think, Holliston should at least explore. Is it possible to get something like that where you could pick your area? You're not going to do it all at once, but, start picking the area. We've got so much conservation land. We've got almost 3,000 acres of land that we've set aside for open space, but it's going to be a desert if we're not careful.
It changes the whole ecosystem.
It does. It does, and you just have to deal with it. So, all right. So before we run out of time, I want to make sure that I haven't left out anything that you wanted to bring up for today, or if you wanted to talk briefly about looking ahead. Are you collecting any ideas from people in town about things that they're concerned about? Is this a good time for them to talk to you?
This is actually a great time, and I was thinking about putting up a little survey or something on my Facebook. People are pretty great about sharing information, whether it be on social media or calling into the office, but I'm particularly this time of year when we're coming into next session, we file new legislation in January. So in the fall is usually when we start thinking about and drafting ideas for next session. So I would love to hear from folks if they have ideas. One of the things that I wanted to mention that I'm working on, because I know it's of interest to a lot of people, is the commuter rail line.
Oh, God, lived on it for a while.
Well, a lot of folks in this area obviously commute into Boston, and an increasing number of our local companies that support our local economy are needing to draw predominantly younger employees from in Boston who don't want to own cars and want to use public transit, and we have very limited reverse commute service here. So in addition to improving but still not very high quality service here and reliability out of Framingham, we've got this reverse commute issue, and I'm sort of taking that on as a member of the Transportation Committee. I think we really have an opportunity with the West Station proposal, and I know some folks may be familiar with that. They're doing some improvements to the Pike in the area of Boston University in town in Alston.
Okay. Yep.
And they're proposing to put in a new commuter rail stop called West Station there, which they're very excited about. It's going to be kind of a Kendall Square, the next Kendall Square, in partnership with Harvard. However, that has a lot of downstream impacts to us and our region. And it's one more example of what we see often, which is sort of this competing for resources. You know, Boston gets a lot of resources in the state, and one of the big parts of my job is to make sure that we're fighting for and getting our share of the state pie. And so as part of this conversation, I see real opportunity for us here in Metro West to assert ourselves in getting additional resources all the way down the line.
Yeah.
And, you know, potentially some commuter rail service. So I'm looking at how to structure that. And I'm also on this new group called the Vision Committee for Commuter Rail, which is meeting for the second time tomorrow, where we're talking about, you know, people always ask, you know, what we got to think beyond just kind of tomorrow. We need to think big picture. So this is the big picture conversation. You know, how do we want to do this? How do we want to integrate commuter rail with MBTA?
Yeah.
Do we want to have an urban core system? So our commuter rail from Alston in, for example, would be more of a T-type regular service with commuter rail on the outer. And so all those conversations are happening. And then, of course, how will we fund those improvements?
Has anybody started talking about the monorail down the middle of the turnpike? Because that one's an old one.
I've brought that up.
That one goes back to, I think, I don't know, the early 70s when they were talking about putting an airport out here. That came up. And you've got this whole median strip down the middle of the turnpike. And it was like, why don't we just put in a monorail? And you can move people east and west, you know? And so I just add that to, you know, your considerations. Nothing should be off the table at this point.
No. And electric. A lot of conversation about electric.
Absolutely. When you look at the traffic in downtown Holliston, and I know lots of people lament the fact that, you know, it's because of the lights or it's because of the this or the that's. It's not. It's because there's too many people.
Volume.
You know, there's a lot of people trying to go through very narrow old roads that weren't designed or intended to absorb it.
No.
So
for anyone who's on the Pike.
Yeah. Oh my God.
It has been just anecdotally for me, it was very hot. You know, it's increased fairly dramatically by a third over in the last 2 years. And I mentioned that to Mass Highway, and I said, you know, do you have any numbers, data? And they said, absolutely. It has absolutely increased, and they thought it was most likely because of the economy being so healthy.
Yeah, well,
people
and also
buy cars and they drive because they're not as cost conscious.
I think that's also because the housing prices are high, and so people go farther and farther west, and they end up in Upton, they end up in Uxbridge, they end up in, and so you get more development that way, but they need a car to be able to get where they're going. So, you know, I think it's a combination of things, but definitely we've got a lot of people to move around.
Yep.
All right, Carolyn, thank you very much for joining me today. I think this has been great.
And we'll have to schedule our next
We'll definitely do it. We'll do it, you know, another quarter, whatever that is, December. Sometimes in December. Okay, thanks, folks. That's it for today from Just Thinking, and check in with us again next time. Bye.